20,000 seats, one decision, and the entire tennis world erupted. They handed the main court to her rival, and what happened next shook the sport to its foundation. Queues stretched endlessly through Melbourne Park. Thousands pressed forward, shoulder to shoulder, desperate to witness something historic. And organizers had buried it on a mid-sized court, tucked away from the spotlight. This was not an accident. This was a choice. And the consequences? Uncontrollable. What you are about to hear is the story of a scheduling scandal so reckless, so tone-deaf, so blindingly arrogant that it didn't just anger fans, it forced an entire sport to confront its own double standards. Stay until the very end, because what tournament officials did after the fallout will either restore your faith in tennis or destroy it completely. Nobody becomes the most talked about player in women's tennis by accident. Alexandra Eala, 20 years old, had already become undeniably the most famous name circulating across every tennis platform, every fan forum, every conversation about the future of the sport. That was an opinion. That was data. That was crowd behavior. That was ticket sales speaking louder than any ranking number ever could. Eala had arrived at Melbourne Park as the Philippines' most visible tennis export, her ascent tracked closely by a global Filipino audience that had waited decades for representation at the sport's highest level. Decades, not years. Decades of watching from afar, of cheering for other nations' daughters, of wondering when someone would finally carry that flag into the biggest arenas on earth. And here she stood. She had already rewritten Philippine tennis history multiple times over in a single calendar year. She had rocketed up the WTA rankings to world number 49 and had put Philippine tennis on the map, becoming a household name after shocking world number 2 Iga Swiatek on her run to the Miami Open semifinals, then becoming the first player from the Philippines to win a Grand Slam match at the US Open. Think about the weight of that sentence. The first. Not the first in a generation, the first, ever. She had trained at Rafael Nadal's academy, soared into global prominence, made history at Eastbourne, becoming the first Filipino to reach a WTA final, and then delivered that nerve-wracking US Open comeback win against Clara Tauson that had an entire nation holding its breath. And after all of that, after every shattered ceiling, every historic milestone, every sold-out viewing party across 12 time zones, when Australian Open organizers sat down to build the order of play for her main draw debut, the biggest moment of her young career, they looked at all that evidence and made a decision that defied comprehension. They placed her on court 6, not center court, not a show court, not even a venue with overflow capacity. A mid-sized court tucked within Melbourne Park, chosen for a player whose fan base had just turned the Australian Open grounds into something unrecognizable. The match hadn't even started yet, and the chaos was already irreversible. Here is where the story shifts from triumph to outrage. The scene outside Court 6 on that Monday afternoon was astonishing. The queue to watch Alexandra Eala stretched endlessly through Melbourne Park. Hundreds of fans lined up with patience and excitement. Many simply hoped to witness her Australian Open main draw debut in person. The line extended back toward Rod Laver Arena itself, the cathedral of Australian tennis, while Eala's match was assigned a fraction of its capacity. Let that image register. The line reached Rod Laver Arena. They couldn't get into the court near Rod Laver Arena. With Melbourne home to a thriving Filipino community, the turnout felt inevitable. The decision to place Eala on a mid-sized court quickly drew scrutiny, particularly as match time approached and queues swelled into the thousands. Many arrived hours early, fearing they might miss out. And many did. Unable to gain entry, they settled for packed outdoor viewing areas, watching on large screens. Packed outdoor viewing areas. These are fans who purchased Australian Open tickets, full price, legitimate access to the grounds, and ended up watching through a screen outside because tournament directors had fundamentally miscalculated the magnitude of what Alexandra Eala means to an entire population. Frustration followed swiftly. Many felt the chaos was entirely avoidable. A larger show court could have resolved the pressure instantly. Putting Ayla on court 6 is just dumb, tennis journalist Jose Morgado stated plainly. The sentiment echoed across social media and inside the grounds. Veteran tennis reporter Ben Rothenberg echoed similar alarm. This unwise court placement was one of my first reactions when looking at today's order of play. Two of the sport's most respected journalists, not fans, not social media commentators, professionals who attend every Grand Slam, who understand scheduling logic, who know the mechanics of tournament operations, both independently called it wrong within hours. And yet the gates stayed locked. The decision stood unchanged. Meanwhile, inside Court 6, something extraordinary unfolded anyway. Every Eala point sparked wild celebration. Philippine flags filled the stands, chants of "Let's go Alex" rang out, and even routine exchanges were met with deafening roars rippling across the grounds. From seating to courtside ledges, not a single empty spot existed. Imagine the energy that never made it inside those gates. Now ask yourself, whose rival was given the benefit of a proper venue that same week? Who got the main court treatment that Eala deserved and was denied? That answer is coming, and it will make everything that follows feel like justice arriving exactly on schedule. By midnight, the story had escaped tennis circles entirely. It wasn't trending in sports, it was trending everywhere. 20,000 estimated fans had been affected, either locked out physically, stranded in overflow zones, or robbed of the experience they had specifically traveled, planned, and purchased for. The hashtags multiplied faster than any PR team could manage. If there was one thing the earlier rounds of major tournaments had already demonstrated, it was that Eala had quickly become one of the sport's biggest draws. Her fans follow her wherever she goes, and Filipino supporters had done wonders for ticket sales at multiple venues. Tournament organizers already knew this. They had witnessed it repeatedly. The Dubai Tennis Championships had learned this lesson. The Miami Open had documented it. The U.S. Open had felt it vibrating through the stands during her historic win over Clara Towson. This was not a surprise. This was negligence dressed as oversight. Fans inside Court 6 had already crossed what many considered acceptable boundaries, loudly cheering the errors and even the double faults of opponent Alicia Parks, creating a soccer-like atmosphere rarely witnessed at a Grand Slam. Tennis etiquette, centuries old, bent under the sheer raw passion of a fan base, watching their icon perform for the very first time on the grandest stage. Parks herself admitted she was rattled. She was seen in tears after losing the first set 6-0. She said, "It was very difficult. I was expecting it, but I wasn't. She definitely has a good crowd." Parks recovered. Eala eventually fell. The match result, however painful, was not what the internet was arguing about. They were arguing about the thousands turned away, about the families who had saved money, booked flights, arranged childcare, coordinated across time zones, all to be met with a locked gate and a portable screen. They were arguing about the rival who, in subsequent rounds, received prime scheduling on a venue 3 times the size of Court 6, despite drawing a fraction of the crowd, selling a fraction of the tickets, generating a fraction of the cultural conversation. A large portion of Eala's fan base were there solely to support her, and once she was eliminated, those seats emptied. That ripple effect, empty stadiums for matches that followed, became its own embarrassment for tournament organizers who had placed the wrong player on the wrong court at the wrong time. The irony was devastating. They had boosted a rival into the spotlight Eala deserved, and that rival played to half-full stands while Eala's fans grieved outside. You cannot manufacture that kind of karma. It simply arrives. When institutions get it wrong at this scale, one of two things occurs. They deflect or they acknowledge. What Australian Open officials chose to do fell somewhere painfully between both. Responding to a fan complaint on social media platform X, the tournament stated it would learn for next year. 3 words that carried the full weight of institutional inadequacy. Learn for next year. Next year. Tell that to the grandmother who flew from Manila. Tell that to the child who had never seen professional tennis live, clutching a Philippine flag that never made it past the security barrier. Tell that to the thousands who stood under the Melbourne afternoon sun, waiting for a gate that never opened wide enough. Learn for next year is what organizations say when they have no adequate defense of what happened this year. Veterans recognized the moment immediately. Novak Djokovic, asked about congestion and scheduling, called the situation a good problem to have. Packed courts and excess demand, he said, are signs of a sport extending beyond its traditional centers, even if logistics struggle to keep pace. Jessica Pegula echoed the sentiment, noting that players who attract new audiences strengthen tennis in the long term, even when tournaments are forced to recalibrate in real time. Diplomatic, measured, and completely insufficient for 20,000 people who deserved better. The WTA itself had already faced this exact criticism at earlier tournaments in the 2026 season. The powers that be hadn't done enough to capitalize on Eala's popularity and had repeatedly scheduled her at strange times on smaller courts. The 20-year-old had become the main event whether organizers acknowledged it or not, and it was growing increasingly difficult to take the spotlight off her. So when Dubai finally corrected course, giving Eala the night session slot on center court, the most coveted position in the sport for her clash against Jasmine Paolini, the tennis world exhaled and said, "Finally." But Dubai's correction raised an agonizing retrospective question. If Dubai could do it right, why couldn't Melbourne? If a WTA 500 event in the United Arab Emirates could read the room and honor Eala's magnitude properly, why did Australian Open officials, with infinite more resources, historical precedent, and advance warning, choose Court 6? The uncomfortable answer forming across fan communities, journalist columns, and tennis forums was this: because the system was not built with players like Alexandra Eala in mind, and the system had not fully decided how to update itself. That is not conspiracy. That is institutional inertia meeting an unstoppable cultural force. And the collision produced 20,000 locked-out fans and a hashtag that didn't die for weeks.